The screaming came from the horses, not from swords finding armor, not from men dying in the mud. From horses, wounded in the flanks by arrows, galloping blind and panicking through the lines of the army they were supposed to be saving. And as those horses ran, they took with them everything the most powerful military force in medieval Europe had counted on to win. On the morning of October 25th, 1415, approximately 6,000 English soldiers stood on a freshly plowed field in northern France. Contemporary accounts and the research of historians, including Juliet Barker, place their numbers at roughly 5,000 archers and 900 men-at-arms. Many of them suffering from dysentery so severe that, according to Barker's documentation of contemporary sources, soldiers had cut away their own breeches during the march just to keep moving. They had walked 260 miles in 17 days on near-empty stomachs. Facing them was a French army that mainstream historians, including Barker, Jonathan Sumption, and Clifford Rogers, estimate at somewhere between 20,000 and 36,000 men. 3 royal dukes, 9 counts, the Constable of France, the Marshal of France, the assembled military aristocracy of a kingdom. Henry V ordered his sick, starving, outnumbered army to advance toward them. Here is what the chronicles have never fully answered. Why was he so certain? The Gesta Henrici Quinti, the closest thing we have to an English eyewitness account of the campaign, written by a chaplain in the king's household, records that Henry's own council begged him not to march overland from Harfleur in the first place. He overruled them. He marched 260 miles into a confrontation he had no tactical right to survive. And then, on a narrow strip of farmland between 2 French woodlands, he won one of the most decisive military victories of the medieval era. The chronicles document what he did. They have never fully explained what he knew or believed that made him certain enough to do it. Before this is over, you'll understand 3 things that popular history tends to bury. First, the tactic that neutralized France's most powerful weapon was borrowed directly from 2 battles that had already humiliated France 70 years earlier. And the French High Command walked into it anyway. Second, the highest-ranking English officer killed at Agincourt died not from a French weapon, but from the weight of French bodies. And his title passed to a 4-year-old nephew who could not yet hold a sword. And third, the casualties of a single afternoon left such a vacuum in French political power that the Duke of Burgundy, who had contributed almost nothing to the battle, was marching on Paris within 10 days, setting in motion the chain of events that would give Henry the French crown itself 5 years later. To understand why a king who had every reason to sail home to safety chose instead to march 260 miles toward the largest army in France, we need to go back to 1413. And the moment Henry V decided that France wasn't a prize to be negotiated for. It was a debt owed to him by God. He was born in Monmouth, in Wales, on approximately the 16th of September, 1387. A detail worth noting because it means that on the morning of Agincourt, Henry V of England was 28 years old. Not a prodigy. Not a young commander in over his head. A tested, experienced, deliberately trained soldier who had been building toward this moment for his entire adult life. The Lancastrian dynasty Henry inherited had a problem that no amount of battlefield success could permanently solve. His father, Henry IV, had seized the English throne from Richard II in 1399. That usurpation was 12 years in the past by the time Henry V was crowned in 1413. But its shadow had not lifted. The dynasty ruled by force and by survival, not by undisputed right. Rebellion had come repeatedly. The Percy uprising at Shrewsbury in 1403, Owain Glyndwr's long Welsh insurgency, the Lollard agitation, the Southampton plot. there was always someone who believed the Lancastrian crown sat on an illegitimate head. Henry had been at Shrewsbury, at 16 years old, fighting alongside his father. Contemporary accounts document that he was struck in the face by an arrow during that battle. An arrow that lodged in the bone near his eye. What followed was one of the most remarkable pieces of medieval surgical documentation to survive. Near contemporary accounts describe the procedure required to extract the arrowhead, which involved a specially designed instrument inserted 6 inches into the wound while the king's son held still. He held still. He recovered. He learned at 16 that arrows could be survived, that fear was a choice, and that the difference between kings and the men they commanded was often simply a willingness to stand in the same danger. By the time Henry took the throne in 1413, his military education was complete. What remained was the political problem. A successful foreign war, specifically the war with France, that his great-great-grandfather Edward III had begun in 1337 over competing claims to the French crown, would serve multiple purposes simultaneously. It would unify the English nobility behind a common enemy rather than against each other. It would generate revenue through conquest and the ransoms of captured French lords. And it would, in the bluntest possible terms, give the son of a usurper a reason for people to stop thinking about where his throne came from. Henry's territorial demands of France were extraordinary. He wanted the full restoration of the Angevin Empire. Normandy, Touraine, Maine, Aquitaine, and more. Historians note that even a distracted, weakened France was unlikely to concede this, and Henry may have known it. Britannica's assessment is that, although such demands were unlikely to be conceded even by the distracted government of France under King Charles VI, Henry seems to have convinced himself that his claims were just. Whether that conviction was genuine faith or strategic positioning, the chronicles do not settle the question. What the chronicles do document is that Henry prepared with methodical thoroughness. He organized shipping. He assembled an army of approximately 11,000 to 12,000 men, including some 2,500 men-at-arms and 8,000 archers, according to the Gesta Henrici Quinti. He arranged financing through Parliament and through loans from wealthy English citizens. London alone, according to History.com, loaned the modern equivalent of roughly $5 million, secured against pieces of the royal treasury, including a diamond-encrusted crown. And 3 weeks before he was scheduled to sail, Henry uncovered a conspiracy to kill him. The Southampton plot, involving Henry, Lord Scrope, and Richard, Earl of Cambridge, had planned to replace Henry with the Earl of March. Henry had the conspirators arrested and executed. Then he sailed anyway, on the 11th of August, 1415. The fleet that carried 11,000 English soldiers across the English Channel was heading toward a siege, a march, and an encounter with the French army that Henry's council would beg him to avoid. He had survived an arrowhead in the face. He had survived an assassination plot. He had been preparing for this war since before he could legally be called a man. What waited for him in France was not just an army. It was a kingdom in the final stages of destroying itself. And Henry intended to be standing when the destruction was complete. The King of France believed he was made of glass. This is not metaphor. This is medical history. Charles VI of France suffered from recurrent episodes of severe psychotic illness, documented extensively in French royal chronicles. At the worst periods of his condition, and there were many, Charles reportedly believed that his body was constructed of glass, that he would shatter if touched. He had metal rods reportedly sewn into his clothing to protect him from impact. He sometimes failed to recognize his own family. He could not consistently rule, and he had not been able to consistently rule for years. Into this vacuum rushed two factions, and what followed was a civil war that made France functionally ungovernable at exactly the moment it most needed to be governed. On one side stood the Armagnacs, aligned with the royal house and dominated by Louis, Duke of Orléans. On the other stood the Burgundians, led by John, Duke of Burgundy, a man whose political calculations were so precise and so cold that historians have compared him to a chess player watching his opponents clear the board of pieces he hadn't used. The two factions had moved past political rivalry into actual violence. While Henry was assembling an invasion fleet in England, France was engaged in a civil war that had already produced assassinations, shifting alliances, and the effective paralysis of the central government. The French command structure that assembled to answer Henry's invasion in 1415 reflected this dysfunction directly. The army was nominally commanded by Charles d'Albret, the Constable of France, and Jean Le Mangret, known throughout Europe as Boucicaut, the Marshal of France. Both were experienced, professional soldiers. D'Albret had been a capable military administrator for years. Boucicaut had fought at Nicopolis in 1396 and survived a catastrophic defeat there, learning the kind of tactical humility that comes from watching an army destroyed by its own overconfidence. Multiple contemporary sources and historians, including the medieval history analysis, confirmed that both men recognized what Henry was attempting and argued against a direct engagement. They were outranked, not militarily, but socially, and in the feudal hierarchy that governed French command decisions, social rank was effectively military rank. Several great dukes were present in the French army, men who outranked d'Albret and Boucicaut in the French hierarchy, regardless of their battlefield credentials. These lords had assembled from across France to crush an English invasion, and they intended to crush it in the manner appropriate to their status. In the front rank, at the point of maximum glory, with the maximum number of high-born witnesses. They wanted battle. They wanted ransoms. They wanted the credit for ending the English incursion. According to Enguerrand de Monstrelet, the near-contemporary Burgundian chronicler, French knights were reportedly wagering on who among them would capture Henry personally, with some 400 lances staking an estimated 1,500 gold crowns on this question the night before the battle. And the Duke of Burgundy himself? He contributed almost nothing. John of Burgundy had sent a token force to satisfy the appearance of loyalty to the crown, then watched from a careful distance. What he was watching for was the result. If the Armagnac-dominated army crushed Henry and the Armagnac faction emerged from the campaign with its prestige intact, Burgundy would be no better positioned than before. If the Armagnac army was destroyed, the Armagnac faction, which had dominated the French court and which Burgundy loathed, would be leaderless, and Paris would be available. Historians confirm he had begun maneuvering toward exactly that outcome before Henry's army had even reached the coast. Here is what made France genuinely dangerous, despite all of this dysfunction. The individual soldiers it had assembled were extraordinary. The Savaron, the armored men-at-arms at the core of the French military, were professional warriors in some of the finest plate armor in Europe. The Constable d'Albret, for all the political problems above him, was a capable leader. Boucicaut was one of the most experienced combat commanders on the continent. The men they were commanding had trained for war since childhood, wore armor that represented decades of metallurgical refinement, and rode horses specifically bred and trained for cavalry warfare. France was not weak. France was very strong and very divided, and the combination would prove more dangerous to itself than to its enemies. D'Albret and Boucicaut knew what was coming. They argued against it, and they lost the argument to men whose confidence in their own nobility they could not overcome. The skeletons tell the story most clearly. When Henry VIII's warship, the Mary Rose, sank in the Solent in 1545 and was raised from the seabed in 1982, archaeologists found among her cargo 172 intact longbows. They also found the men who had used them. The skeletons of the archers aboard the Mary Rose showed something remarkable. Enlarged left arms, significantly larger than the right, twisted spines, and thickened, deformed joints around the left wrist, left shoulder, and right fingers. These were not injuries. They were adaptations, the physical signature of a lifetime of drawing a bow with a draw weight that the Mary Rose finds confirmed at an average of 150 to 160 pounds. For comparison, a bow used in Olympic archery competition today typically draws at around 50 pounds. English longbowmen were not athletes in the modern sense. Their bodies had been physically reshaped from childhood by their weapon. The English longbow was approximately 6 feet tall, often taller than the man carrying it, constructed from a single piece of yew that used the natural layering of the wood. The harder heartwood on the inside of the bow to resist compression, the more flexible sapwood on the outside to resist tension. The result was a weapon that could project a war arrow with enough force at close range to penetrate armor at joints and face openings. A trained longbowman could loose 10 to 12 arrows per minute, according to the consensus of historians, including those cited in the History Is Now magazine analysis of longbow effectiveness. A crossbowman, by comparison, could manage 2 to 3 bolts per minute. On a battlefield, that difference was not tactical. It was existential. English law had been manufacturing this advantage for over a century. Multiple statutes, from the Assize of Arms of 1252 through the regulations of Edward I and his successors, required able-bodied Englishmen of specific income levels to own bows and practice regularly. Towns were required to maintain archery ranges. Boys trained from age 7. A law under Henry I reportedly exempted from prosecution anyone who killed a man during archery practice. The Crown was that serious about maintaining its pool of trained archers. The result, by 1415, was something no other European nation could replicate. A standing reserve of tens of thousands of men who had been drawing heavy bows for most of their lives, whose bodies had been physically adapted to the task, and who could sustain a rate of fire that made mathematical nonsense of any cavalry charge. The French, by contrast, had made a deliberate philosophical choice. French military culture associated the bow with servants and hired men, not with noblemen, not with the chivalric ideal of the armored warrior on horseback. As early as 1368, King Charles V had ordered mass training of French archers, but the noble resistance was fierce. Sources note that the nobility regarded the bow as a peasant weapon, unsuitable for men of their station. 47 years of evidence that this belief was catastrophically wrong. Crécy in 1346, Poitiers in 1356, had not persuaded them. Henry V's army at Agincourt, as the Gesta Henrici Quinti and other contemporary sources confirm, was approximately 80% longbowmen. Of the roughly 6,000 soldiers who marched to the battlefield, approximately 5,000 were archers. The 900 to 1,000 men-at-arms who complemented them were not the primary weapon. They were the anvil. The archers were the hammer. Consider what that meant in practical terms. 5,000 archers, each capable of 10 arrows per minute, represented a sustained output of 50,000 arrows per minute at peak fire. In the first 3 minutes of an engagement, that force could theoretically project 150,000 arrows. Even accounting for fatigue, reduced fire under combat conditions, and the practical limits of ammunition supply, the opening phase of any engagement Henry designed would produce an aerial storm of iron-headed shafts that no army in medieval Europe had adequately prepared to face. The French army at Agincourt did have crossbowmen and missile troops, approximately 4,000 to 5,000 by the estimates of Sumption and others. But their commanders placed them behind the men-at-arms in the French formation. Their ranged capability was neutralized before a single bolt was fired. This was not bad luck. It was the inevitable consequence of a command structure where social prestige, fighting in the vanguard, where glory was, outweighed tactical logic. Henry had chosen his army. The French had chosen their traditions. The question was whether the field between them would allow those traditions to survive contact with physics. Harfleur was supposed to take a few days. Henry landed on the Normandy coast on the 14th of August, 1415. With approximately 11,000 men and the tactical assumption that the strategically important port of Harfleur, controlling the mouth of the Seine and the access to Normandy, would fall quickly, he was wrong by 5 weeks. The siege dragged through August and into September as the garrison held and reinforced its defenses, and as the English besieging army camped in low-lying ground near the river marshes in summer heat. Disease followed, specifically dysentery, which spread through an encampment of thousands of men and horses in unsanitary conditions with the efficiency that medieval armies had learned over centuries to expect and dread. Harfleur fell on the 22nd of September, but the victory came at a catastrophic price. The Gesta Henrici Quinti records enormous losses at the siege, though the exact figures are disputed by historian Ian Mortimer, who considers the Gesta's numbers inflated. What is not disputed is this: Henry's army had been reduced from approximately 11,000 to roughly 6,000 to 9,000 men, depending on which historian's estimate you accept, with many of those remaining actively ill. He garrisoned the captured town, appointed an English governor, and faced a decision. The sensible option was obvious: sail home. The season was late. The campaign had cost far more in men than anyone had anticipated, and the French army was assembling around Rouen with time to intercept whatever Henry chose to do next. His own council made the sensible argument: take the fleet, take Calais, go home, and regroup. Henry told them he was marching to Calais instead. The march began on the 8th of October, 1415. Calais was approximately 260 miles north, according to the College of Arms documentation. Henry expected to cover the distance in roughly 8 days. The French had other plans. Cavalry blocked the known Somme crossings and destroyed bridges, forcing Henry's exhausted army eastward and inland, adding days to a march that was already destroying men who had not recovered from Harfleur. Food ran critically short. The French scorched the countryside to deny the English supply. What Barker documents through contemporary accounts, that soldiers had cut away their own breeches to accommodate the dysentery that continued to rack the army, is one of the most viscerally specific details in medieval military history. These men were not marching in silence and dignity. They were marching in misery, held together by discipline and the simple fact that stopping meant surrender. Henry finally found a Somme crossing at Voyenne on the 19th and 20th of October, nearly 2 weeks into the march. He crossed and turned north. The French army, which had been tracking him along the opposite bank, crossed as well and moved ahead to block his path. By the 24th of October, with Calais only about 45 miles away, according to World History Encyclopedia, 2 days' march for a healthy army, the French had positioned themselves across the road. The two armies camped in the open that night, within sight of each other's fires, close enough that contemporary sources describe being able to hear sounds from the opposing camp. The English had been marching for 17 days. They were almost out of food. There was no relief force coming. Calais was a day and a half away and completely unreachable. Henry had two choices: fight on ground the French had chosen, or surrender and hope for decent treatment. He chose neither. He chose to fight, but on ground of his own choosing. Multiple sources confirm that d'Albret and Boucicaut had been arguing for the more patient French strategy throughout the pursuit: surround the English, deny them food and sleep, and accept their surrender when starvation and disease completed what the march had begun. The French nobles overruled them. They wanted battle. They were about to get exactly what they wanted, and the result would be recorded in the heralds' lists for 600 years. The fires in the French camp burned bright enough to be seen from the English lines. Monstrelet's Chronicle, the Burgundian near-contemporary account that historians treat as a significant secondary source, records the French camp that night as festive. Great lords were gaming and wagering, confident of what morning would bring. Some 400 knights had reportedly staked approximately 1,500 gold crowns on who among them would capture the English king. The French expected to take ransoms. High-ranking prisoners in medieval warfare were enormously valuable commodities. The Duke of Orleans, for example, would eventually generate a ransom large enough to sustain a small kingdom. And the French lords understood that Henry V himself, captured, would be the most valuable prisoner taken in a generation. They were not thinking about the possibility of defeat. They were thinking about how to divide the profits of victory. Henry's camp was ordered into silence. The Gesta Henrici Quinti records this directly. Strict orders against noise, against light, against anything that would communicate weakness or disorder to the French, watching from across the field. Soldiers were to remain quiet and guard against French night raids. One small raid was repelled without significant incident. What the English troops did in that silence, what they thought, what they prayed, what agreements they made with God in the particular way that men make agreements with God when they are certain they are about to die. The chronicles preserve only an outline. Priests heard confessions throughout the English camp that night. The Gesta records this, without elaboration. The way a document records a fact so obvious, it needs no explanation. Henry moved among his men. The Gesta confirms that the king walked through his camp that night, speaking to groups of soldiers, visible and present among the people he commanded. Whether he did this in disguise, as Shakespeare dramatized in the famous night-walking scene of Henry V, where the king borrows a cloak and walks incognito, is not confirmed in the contemporary sources. What Shakespeare gave the scene was the words and the anonymity. What the Gesta documents is the fact that Henry did not spend the night before Agincourt in the comfort of his command tent. He walked, he spoke. He was, by every contemporary account of his character, genuinely present with his army in a way that professional soldiers then and now recognize as the single most important thing a commander can do the night before battle. Multiple historians, including the assessment in EBSCO's research entry on Henry, note that he shared the hardships of campaigns with his troops, and that this combination of physical courage and visible presence was a deliberate and consistent element of his leadership style, not a performance for a specific occasion. The morning brought practical preparations. Henry received Mass before first light. He organized his 3 divisions, his vanguard, his main battle, and his rear guard, under experienced commanders, with himself positioned in the main battle at the center. Sir Thomas Erpingham, described in the Gesta as a knight grown gray with age and honor, was assigned to organize the English deployment. He was, by contemporary accounts, old enough that his presence in the line was a statement rather than a tactical necessity. The kind of statement that men who are about to be terrified find steadying. Contemporary sources also document that Henry made a diplomatic gesture the night before battle, offering to surrender Harfleur and pay reparations in exchange for safe passage to Calais. The French declined. Whether this was genuine negotiation or calculated demonstration that he had sought peace before accepting battle. The chronicles record the offer, but not Henry's interior thinking. The fog of October morning settled over the field between the armies. The French, enormously outnumbered in longbowmen and enormously superior in heavy cavalry, were in position and ready. They had not slept badly. They had not gone hungry. They were rested, armed, and confident, and they outnumbered their opponents by a margin that every principle of medieval military doctrine said was sufficient. What they had not adequately considered was the field itself. The ground between the armies had been plowed. This is not a minor detail. A freshly plowed field produces a fundamentally different kind of mud than unplowed earth. Deeper, stickier, with a clay consistency that grips boots and hooves and pulls at every step with a force that compounds with each subsequent step across the same ground. Add a week of heavy autumn rain, which multiple independent contemporary sources, both English and French, confirm had fallen before the battle, and the field between the armies was not merely inconvenient. It was a trap, though neither army had made it. The weather and the season had made it, and what distinguished the two armies was which side could be destroyed by it. The battlefield itself was a geographic funnel. The battlefield travels archaeological and historical analysis, drawing on the primary sources, describes the fighting ground as a shallow valley approximately 900 to 1,000 yards wide at its widest point, flanked on the east by the forest of Tramecourt and on the west by the forest of Agincourt. The woodlands were dense enough to prevent cavalry from passing through them in any organized fashion. This meant that the full width of the French army, which at 20,000 to 36,000 men occupied an enormous amount of space, could only be deployed in depth, not in breadth. The front that could actually engage the English was determined not by French numbers, but by the width of the gap between the trees. For an army whose primary advantage was numerical, this was geometrically catastrophic. Henry understood this before he deployed. His advance, documented in the Gesta and confirmed in multiple other sources, was not a charge. It was a deliberate repositioning. Henry moved his entire line forward approximately 700 yards from its initial position, advancing slowly until the flanking archers on both wings reached the tree lines on either side of the field. This accomplished two things simultaneously. It brought the English archers within effective shooting range of the French position, approximately 250 to 300 yards, within the documented effective range of the longbow. And it eliminated, permanently, whatever remaining possibility existed of a French cavalry force riding around the English flank through the woods. Once the English flanks were flush against the trees, the geometry was set. During or immediately before this advance, the archers drove sharpened wooden stakes into the ground at an angle pointing toward the French. Multiple contemporary sources confirm this specifically. The Gesta documents it, and other chronicles concur. The tactic drew on a 70-year precedent. The same English tactical tradition that had won at Crécy in 1346 and Poitiers in 1356 had involved archers fighting from protected positions that disrupted cavalry. What Henry added at Agincourt was the stakes as a formal defense, creating a physical barrier that forced any cavalry charge to either slow down and be shot, or turn away and be shot. The stakes did not make the position impregnable. They made a cavalry charge expensive enough that it would need to succeed quickly to justify its cost. And the mud had already made quick anything almost impossible. The French deployment, documented in sources including the account of the Barry Herald, a French eyewitness who recorded the distribution of forces, placed the vanguard, approximately 4,800 men-at-arms, in the first line under d'Albret and Boucicaut. The main battle of approximately 3,000 men-at-arms followed, under the Dukes of Alençon and Bar. A rearguard under the Dukes of Orléans and Bourbon completed the formation. On the flanks, approximately 800 to 1,200 mounted knights were distributed to serve as the force intended to ride down the English archers, eliminating the longbow advantage before the infantry engaged. The French crossbowmen and missile troops, numbering in the thousands according to Sumption and Rogers, were placed behind the men-at-arms where, when the battle finally came, they would contribute almost nothing. Sir Thomas Erpingham rode to the front of the English line. He looked at 5,000 archers and 900 men-at-arms, sick, hungry, standing in mud on a field that had rained for a week. He raised his baton. He threw it into the air. Contemporary sources record the signal he gave as nestroke, meaning approximately, now strike. The English line advanced the last few yards into killing range. 5,000 bows came up together. The sky went dark. Both sides had been standing in position for what contemporary accounts suggest was most of the morning. The French were waiting for reinforcements. Henry was waiting for the French to charge, hoping to fight defensively, as at Crécy and Poitiers, where the English had stood still and let the French come to them. But as the hours passed and Henry's army grew weaker with hunger and illness, the calculus shifted. An army that stands still and hungry deteriorates. An army that advances either fights or retreats. And Henry had already decided he was not retreating. So he advanced, set the stakes, and opened fire. What happened in the first minutes of the engagement has been described by multiple contemporary sources using the same image: arrows darkening the sky. This is not literary embellishment. 5,000 archers at 10 arrows per minute minimum, and skilled English longbowmen could manage 12, represents 50,000 arrows in the air every 60 seconds. In the first volley alone, the sky between the armies was filled with iron-headed shafts. The French cavalry on the flanks charged immediately, exactly as planned. 800 to 1,200 mounted knights assigned to ride down the archers and eliminate their threat before the main infantry engagement. They were the first part of the French plan to fail. John Keegan's analysis, in the face of battle, his landmark study of medieval, Napoleonic, and 20th century combat, makes an argument that most subsequent military historians have accepted. At Agincourt, the longbow's primary lethal effect on the cavalry charge was not against the riders, but against their horses. The men-at-arms wore plate armor that at most effective longbow ranges resisted arrows on the breastplate and helmet. But horses, armored only on the head, were hit in the flanks, the haunches, and the unprotected body with hundreds of arrows within seconds of coming into range. Horses struck in the hindquarters by arrows, which hit with enough force to penetrate muscle deeply even if they did not kill immediately. Do not continue charging. They panic, break direction, and flee. The monk of Saint-Denis, the French royal chronicler whose account provides an independent and unbiased perspective on the French experience of Agincourt, documents specifically what happened next. The wounded, panicking horses galloped back through the French infantry that was massing behind them. These were the thousands of men-at-arms who were preparing for their own advance. The horses that were supposed to clear the English archers instead plowed through the French ranks, scattering men, breaking formation, and churning the already muddy field into something considerably worse. Of the 800 to 1,200 cavalry assigned to the flanking charge, sources suggest only 400 to 500 actually charged. The rest either weren't ready or held back. Even that reduced force turned the ground between the armies into a deeper quagmire as it came and went. The stake barrier contributed to the failure. Contemporary sources confirm that archers had positioned the palings at an angle calculated to deflect or stop charging horses. Whether individual horses were impaled or simply turned away at the sight of the barrier, the effect was the same. The charge that was supposed to neutralize the English archers instead ended in chaos, French casualties, and a churned-up field that was about to receive thousands of men in full plate armor. D'Albret and Boucicaut, watching from the vanguard position, faced the moment that professional soldiers dread. The opening gambit failing spectacularly, and the plan now requiring improvisation. The cavalry was gone. The archers were still there, still shooting. The vanguard of 4,800 armored men-at-arms was about to advance on foot across 300 yards of October mud toward 5,000 bows that had just demonstrated exactly what they could do. The mathematics of what followed were already being decided. The men walking into them just didn't know it yet. 300 yards. That is the distance the French vanguard had to cross between their starting position and the English line after Henry's army had advanced into range. In ordinary conditions, on firm ground, in comfortable weather, without arrows, 4,800 armored men-at-arms could cover 300 yards in approximately 3 minutes. At Agincourt, on October 25th, 1415, in freshly plowed mud after a week of rain, wearing 50 to 60 pounds of plate armor with visors closed against the arrows, covering the same ground took considerably longer. The physics were punishing before a single sword was swung. Plate armor of the quality worn by French men-at-arms weighed between 50 and 60 pounds, roughly the equivalent of carrying a full suitcase on every limb simultaneously. In normal conditions, trained knights moved in this armor with relative efficiency. In calf-deep mud that gripped and held with each step, that armor became a liability that compounded with every yard covered. The Gesta Henrici Quinti and the Monk of Saint-Denis, the English and French eyewitness sources, both document the effect. And the fact that they document it independently from opposing perspectives makes their agreement on this point particularly significant. The men who reached the English line were not the same men who had started 300 yards back. They were exhausted in a way that plate armor makes distinctive. Unable to simply fall down and rest, unable to breathe deeply through visors that narrowed airflow, unable to see clearly through eye slits that reduced peripheral vision to almost nothing. The archers, meanwhile, were shooting at the flanks. The Gesta records this specifically. The archers at the angled positions along the tree lines were quote, _3, __. This means the French vanguard was not being shot at only from the front. The herringbone deployment of English archers, wedged between the men-at-arms and running to the flanks along the tree lines, created interlocking fields of fire. A man advancing straight at the English center was being hit from the front by the archers stationed there, and simultaneously from both sides by the archers positioned at angles against the woods. There was no direction from which approach was comfortable. What happened at the point of contact has been described independently and in almost identical terms by the author of the Gesta Henrici Quinti and the Monk of Saint-Denis. The Gesta records. Quote 4. The Monk of Saint-Denis records, from the French perspective. Quote 5. This is the decisive moment. Not the arrows, not the mud. But this. The French vanguard was so densely packed by the time it reached the English line that professional warriors in superb individual fighting condition could not lift their arms. The men in the front were falling, and the men behind them, unable to see what was happening, continued pushing forward. The second French battle line arrived and added its mass to the press, making the compression worse rather than better. Men at the front were being killed and falling. The men behind were standing on them. The men behind those were standing on the men on the dead. The Gesta describes, quote, 6 of the slain, growing around the English standards, heaps that eventually grew, in that chronicle's account, higher than a man's height, with English soldiers climbing the piles to kill those French who remained standing at the rear. The Gesta makes one admission that honest historians always note, even in this chaos. The sheer weight of the French advance initially pushed the English men-at-arms back in some places. The line bent. This was not a clean slaughter from the first contact. The French were brave, professional warriors, and even exhausted and compressed. They pushed hard enough that the English felt it. The line held, but it held at cost, and it held because the men holding it had nowhere to go. The French main battle line had now joined the press. The rear guard was watching. The carnage in front of them, if they could have seen it clearly through the fog and the press of thousands of bodies, would have told them what was coming. The moment the French reached close quarters, the mathematics of the longbow became irrelevant. You cannot shoot arrows into a melee where your own men are fighting among the enemy. You can switch weapons. And the English archers, lightly equipped by design, wearing padded jacks and leather rather than plate, carrying the axes, daggers, and hand weapons that every fighting man of the period kept for exactly this situation, did exactly that. Multiple contemporary sources confirm the transition. The longbowmen dropped their bows and entered the melee with hand weapons. What followed was not, by any objective definition, a fair fight. Consider the asymmetry that the Gesta and other sources document without quite stating in these terms. The French men-at-arms had marched 300 yards through deepening mud in 50 to 60 pounds of armor under continuous arrow fire, into a press so severe they could barely swing their weapons. By the time they reached hand-to-hand combat, they had been under physical duress for the entirety of their approach. The English archers, by contrast, had been standing or advancing slowly, had expended primarily arm effort rather than full body effort, and arrived at melee range in considerably better physical condition than their opponents. Their lighter equipment, which had seemed a disadvantage compared to French plate armor, now allowed them to move freely in the same mud that was killing the French by its weight. The methods of the killing have been documented in sources including the Osprey publishing analysis of the battle. Plate armor in this period protected the chest and back and the top of the helmet against most attacks. It was vulnerable at the joints, the gaps between plates at the knees, elbows, armpits, and neck, and at the face. Killing a man in full plate armor required either removing his helmet, attacking through the eye slits, or driving a blade into a joint gap. These are cold-blooded, deliberate techniques, not the sweeping battlefield glory that chivalric literature described. Contemporary sources found this disturbing, not because it was unusual in the context of battle, but because Osprey's historical analysis notes the men being killed this way were noblemen and knights, members of the social class whose capture for ransom was a cornerstone of the medieval rules of war. The death of men who would normally be taken prisoner was a violation of convention that contemporary observers noted with discomfort, even as they recorded it as militarily necessary. What followed, over the next hour or two of sustained close combat, was the systematic destruction of the French military aristocracy. Charles d'Albret, Constable of France, the man who had counseled against this battle, was killed in the melee. The Duke of Alençon fought his way to Henry personally, according to New World Encyclopedia's account drawing on contemporary sources, nearly capturing or killing the king before being struck dead in the press. The Duke of Bar was killed. The Duke of Brabant was killed. John I of Alençon, 9 counts, the Admiral of France. David de Rambourg, master of crossbowmen, dead alongside 3 of his sons. The heralds' lists, compiled by heralds from both armies who had watched the battle from a designated neutral position throughout, would eventually confirm 3,069 knights and squires killed with heraldic identification, and another 2,600 bodies found without coats of arms to mark who they had been. Henry V himself was in the front rank throughout. The Gesta Henrici Quinti documents that upon hearing his youngest brother Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, had been wounded in the groin, Henry took his household guard and cut through the press to stand over his brother personally, fighting off French attackers until Gloucester could be dragged to safety. In the course of this fighting, Henry received an axe blow to his helmet that knocked away a piece of the crown affixed to it, confirmed by multiple contemporary sources. He was not directing the battle from a safe position. He was in it. The list of French dead. One historian has written, a line quoted in multiple sources and drawn from the herald's documentation, read like a roll call of the military and political leaders of the past generation. 3 hours of fighting, 3,069 confirmed noble dead. 2,600 more without names. The Constable of France in the mud. 3 dukes, 9 counts. A master of crossbowmen who had brought his sons with him and watched them die before he did. What happened next would shock contemporaries as much as the slaughter itself had. The battle was almost over. The French vanguard and main battle had been effectively destroyed. The killing heaps around the English standards were growing. The rearguard, the 3rd French line under the Dukes of Orléans and Bourbon, was watching and not advancing. High-ranking French prisoners had been taken throughout the melee by English men-at-arms who recognized the financial value of a live duke compared to a dead one. The ransom economy of medieval warfare was functioning exactly as it was supposed to. Then 2 things happened, and Henry V gave an order that contemporary sources found appalling, and that modern historians have consistently analyzed as one of the most ethically complex acts of his reign. The first event, documented in most contemporary sources as the primary trigger. Reports reached Henry that a new French force was rallying for a charge. The Counts of Marle and Fauquemberger, with an estimated 600 men-at-arms, were reportedly gathering for a fresh assault. The second event, cited as the trigger in only one chronicle, Pierre Fenin's account, which the Agincourt 600 project note stands alone in this claim, was a raid on the English baggage train by a local lord named Isambard d'Agincourt, leading approximately 600 peasants, which seized some of Henry's personal treasures, including a crown. Henry's calculation, as multiple historians reconstructed, was straightforward and brutal. His army was exhausted and distributed across the field. The prisoners they had taken were French men-at-arms, professional warriors who knew how to fight, and who were surrounded by the weapons of the dead on every side. If a new French force attacked and the prisoners seized weapons, the English would face a threat from within and without simultaneously. According to Wikipedia's analysis and confirmed in multiple sources, the English knights refused to participate in what Henry ordered next, on the grounds of chivalry and practically the enormous financial loss that killing prisoners represented. Henry ordered an esquire and approximately 200 archers to carry out the killings instead. The methods, documented in contemporary accounts, included slitting throats and burning buildings where wounded prisoners had been sheltered. At least one French knight's account describes prisoners locked inside a building that was then set ablaze. How many were killed is, as historians including Keegan and Curry acknowledge, genuinely uncertain. John Keegan, in The Face of Battle, estimated that relatively few were actually killed before Henry rescinded the order. that 200 archers killing armored men under combat conditions in a limited time before the threat resolved likely produced hundreds of deaths rather than thousands. History.com's survey of the sources gives an upper estimate of approximately 2,200. Anne Curry's research into the ransom contracts from Agincourt, conducted at the University of Southampton, identified at least 320 high-status French prisoners who were successfully ransomed after the battle. Direct evidence that significant numbers survived the massacre order entirely. Contemporary moral assessment was not what modern readers might expect. French chroniclers, including Monstrelet, who had every reason to condemn Henry on behalf of the French nobility, did not blame the king personally. They blamed the French commanders whose failed counterattack had created the situation that Henry's order responded to. The Osprey publishing analysis of the battle notes that what appalled contemporaries was not so much the killing itself as the violation of the convention that noblemen should be captured rather than killed. The chivalric compact that made medieval warfare economically sustainable for the aristocracy on both sides. Henry had violated that compact. His own knights had refused to help him do it. The University of Edinburgh's historical analysis of Agincourt's legacy notes that __, quote, _7, __, in this period, and that the ethics of the massacre were contested even by contemporaries. A mock high court trial held in the United States in 2010 debated whether Henry's order constituted a war crime under the laws of war as they existed in 1415. Modern historians are largely agreed that by contemporary international law, the killing of unarmed prisoners constitutes a war crime. The medieval assessment was more complicated. What is not complicated is that it happened. The chronicles record it. The bone-dry fact sits alongside the extraordinary military achievement of the day. Henry V, who would become Shakespeare's ideal warrior king, ordered the killing of unarmed prisoners at the moment of one of England's greatest victories. History does not simplify its heroes for our convenience. Few things in military history are as revealing as an army that watches a battle and chooses not to join it. The French rearguard, thousands of men under the Dukes of Orléans and Bourbon, men who had marched to Agincourt, put on their armor and arrayed themselves in battle order, now stood at the back of the field and watched what remained of the first two French lines die in the mud. They had the numbers. In raw arithmetic, they could still have tipped the balance. The English were exhausted, distributed across the killing ground, momentarily in the chaos of the prisoner situation. A disciplined charge by thousands of fresh men-at-arms in that moment might, conceivably, have changed something. They did not charge. Henry sent a herald to the third line with a message documented in British battles and multiple sources. If they advanced, they would receive no quarter. The threat was credible. Every man watching from that rearguard position had just seen what happened to men who gave battle on this field and lost. And they had seen, or would shortly hear, what happened to the prisoners. The calculation was immediate and rational. The battle was lost. To enter it now was to die. Honor had its limits, and those limits had apparently been reached. Among the rearguard, however, a small group refused the calculation. The Counts of Marley and Fauconberg, the same counterattack that had triggered Henry's prisoner order, had gathered approximately 600 men-at-arms for a final charge. This charge, according to multiple sources, ended as disastrously as all the others. Whether it was the threat of no quarter, the arrow storm that would have greeted any organized advance, or simply the arithmetic of what had just happened to 20,000 men in this field, the rearguard dissolved. Men left the battlefield individually and in groups. The third French line, the reserve that had never struck a blow, voted with its feet. This is where the heralds became important. Medieval military custom had a formal apparatus for ending battles that modern warfare has largely abandoned. Throughout the fighting, heralds from both armies had occupied a designated neutral position from which they watched and identified the dead by their coats of arms. They were not combatants. They were, in a very real sense, the record keepers of the event, the people whose job it was to determine afterward what had happened, who had died, and what the battle would be called. Henry summoned the heralds from both sides. The principal French herald, Montjoie, was brought before the English king. The question was formal, and its answer was understood. Was the battle conceded? Montjoie confirmed it was. Henry then asked the name of the nearest fortified place. Agincourt, he was told. By medieval convention, documented in multiple sources, battles were named for the nearest castle or fortified structure. Henry declared the victory and named it accordingly. The Battle of Agincourt was over. What remained was the accounting. And the accounting was going to reveal something that the men on both sides, standing in the mud in the October afternoon, had perhaps not yet fully comprehended. The numbers that the heralds would compile over the following hours would transform a military victory into one of the most consequential single days in the history of the 100 Years' War. Marshal Boucicaut, who had argued against fighting, had fought anyway out of professional duty and had survived, was among the prisoners. Charles d'Albret, who had also argued against fighting, had also fought anyway and had not survived, lay somewhere among the thousands of bodies that the heralds were beginning to count. The men who had been right about everything ended the day in the two places where war puts the men who are right too late: in the ground or in chains. The heralds worked through the afternoon. Their task was systematic and, by medieval standards, meticulous, moving through the dead, identifying each body by the heraldic device on its armor or surcoat, recording the name and placing it in the growing register that would constitute the official account of who France had lost at Agincourt. When they were finished, and the work took days in its entirety, the numbers they had compiled would be cited by historians 600 years later as among the most reliable casualty documentation from any medieval battle. 3,069 knights and squires, identified by heraldry. Another 2,600 bodies found without identifying devices. A minimum of 5,669 French nobles and men-at-arms confirmed dead by the contemporary record, with historians including Barker and Sumption estimating the full French death toll at approximately 6,000. Some sources, including British battles, give higher figures of around 8,000. The discrepancy reflects the genuine difficulty of counting the dead of a medieval battle where heralds were working from heraldry and memory, where some bodies were unidentifiable, and where the distinction between killed during the battle and killed during the prisoner massacre was not always clear. The named dead tell the story that raw numbers cannot. 3 royal dukes: John I, Duke of Alençon; Edward, Duke of Bar; Philip, Duke of Brabant; 9 counts: Blamont, Dreux, Fauconberg, Grandpré, Marle, Nevers, Roussy, Vaucourt, Vaudémont; Charles d'Albret, Constable of France, the man who had argued against this battle and died fighting it anyway; the Admiral of France, the Lord of Dampierre; David de Rambures, Master of Crossbowmen, and 3 of his sons. An entire male generation of one family, gone in an afternoon. The master of the royal household, the prévôt of the marshals. In some regions of northern France, according to Wikipedia's synthesis of the herald's documentation, the effect was not merely the death of individuals, but the elimination of entire noble families in the male line. an entire generation of landed nobility annihilated. Against this, the English losses. Approximately 400 killed, according to the scholarly consensus. Agincourt 600's documentation drawn from Currie's research, confirmed by the approach of Barker and others. The highest-ranking English casualty was Edward, Duke of York, who commanded the English right wing and died during the battle. The exact manner of his death is uncertain. Contemporary sources do not specify a French weapon or a dramatic final moment. The most historically supported explanation, though not confirmed in any eyewitness account, is that he fell and was suffocated or crushed in the press of bodies in the fiercest section of the fighting, where Barker notes the casualty rate on his wing was particularly high. He died without children. His title and estates passed to his 4-year-old nephew Richard. The same Richard who would, decades later, become one of England's most consequential military and political figures. Also killed, Michael de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, whose father had died at the Harfleur siege only weeks before. 2 successive earls of a single family, dead within a month of each other. The casualty ratio, derived from the mainstream estimates, 6,000 French dead against 400 English dead, is approximately 15 to 1. If the higher French figure of 8,000 is accepted, the ratio approaches 20 to 1. Military historians studying medieval warfare note that this represents one of the most extreme asymmetries in the documented record of the period. Comparable to Crécy and Poitiers, and in some ways more decisive given the quality and number of the losses. Among the prisoners who survived were names that would echo through European politics for years. Charles, Duke of Orléans, nephew of Charles VI, head of the Armagnac faction, the most politically significant French noble to survive the battle, was taken captive and transported to England. He would remain in English captivity for 25 years. Marshal Boucicaut, who had counseled against everything that led to this disaster, died in English captivity years later, never ransomed, a casualty of the battle in the only way it hadn't killed him on the field. 8,000 or 6,000, or some number between. Not abstractions. Husbands, fathers, sons, brothers. David de Rambouillet had brought 3 of his sons to Agincourt. The women who waited in the manor houses of Picardy and Normandy and across France would receive the news eventually. The battle lasted 3 hours. The grief it created lasted a generation. Henry marched his army to Calais, 45 miles north, past the now silent field at Agincourt, past the forests of Tramecourt and Agincourt, through Picardy, toward the English port that had been his goal since he left Harfleur. He maintained the same discipline on the road after the battle that he had maintained throughout the march. No celebration that would disorder the army, no pillaging, no stragglers. He arrived at Calais, organized the transport of his army and his prisoners across the Channel, and sailed for England. He arrived back in London on the 23rd of November, 1415. What followed was documented by multiple contemporary sources as something England had not produced in 50 years of military failure. An unqualified, unambiguous triumph. Britannica and Wikipedia both describe the reception through contemporary accounts. Choirs sang at the city gates. Maidens with tambourines lined the streets. Banners proclaimed Henry King of France as well as England, his passage to St. Paul's Cathedral was attended by crowds described by eyewitnesses as overwhelming. Most remarkably, and most deliberately, Henry entered London wearing a simple helmet, without the magnificent display of a conquering hero. Contemporary sources note that he attributed the victory entirely to God, rather than to his own generalship or his soldiers' courage. The Gesta Henrici Quinti, whose author was present, records this framing explicitly. and far be it from our people to ascribe their triumph to their own glory or bravery, but to God alone. Processing through the city behind him, in the particular humiliation that medieval warfare inflicted on the captured, were French nobles, including Charles, Duke of Orléans, the most politically significant prisoner in England since, arguably, the capture of the French King John the Good at Poitiers in 1356. Orléans would spend the next 25 years in English captivity, writing poetry in his confinement in a way that has made him, somewhat improbably, one of the most significant French poets of the 15th century. He was 23 years old when he was captured at Agincourt. Shortly after the battle, possibly for the London reception itself, according to Wikipedia, an anonymous composer produced a song that survives to this day. The Agincourt Carol is one of the earliest documented popular songs in the English language, and it is a rousing, entirely unambiguous celebration of the English victory, attributing the triumph to divine will, and presenting Henry as the instrument of God's judgment. Its chorus, quote 9 thanks God for the victory on England's behalf. The carol predates Shakespeare's treatment of Agincourt by nearly 200 years and represents the first mass cultural response to the battle. Not a scholarly account, not a royal proclamation, but a song that ordinary people could sing, and apparently did. The political implications of the victory were profound and immediate. Britannica notes directly that Agincourt quote 10 the son of a usurper, returned to England as what Anne Curry, in her concluding assessment cited in multiple reviews of her scholarship, calls quote 11 the Lancastrian dynasty, which had survived by force and political maneuvering since 1399, now had something it had never possessed. A legitimacy based not on legal argument, but on something that medieval England found more convincing: victory. The kind of victory that looked, to people who believed God took sides in the affairs of kings, like a divine endorsement. In France, meanwhile, Charles VI reportedly suffered another severe psychotic episode on receiving the news. The Armagnac faction that had led the French army was shattered, and the Duke of Burgundy, who had contributed almost nothing to the battle and suffered almost none of its losses, began moving his forces toward Paris within 10 days of the battle, according to the medieval history analysis. The power vacuum that Agincourt had created in French politics was enormous, and Burgundy had been waiting for exactly this moment. The myth began on the day Henry rode through London. Shakespeare would refine it 184 years later, but the original creation was entirely historical. The victory at Agincourt did not win Henry France. It won him the opportunity to win France, and that distinction matters for understanding what the battle actually accomplished in the long arc of history. Henry returned to England, consolidated his position, spent a year in diplomacy and preparation, and sailed back to France in 1417 with a second, larger army. Not for another chevauchée, but for systematic conquest. City by city, castle by castle, he dismantled French military resistance in Normandy. Caen fell. Town after town surrendered or was taken. The siege of Rouen, the Norman capital, lasted months and ended in January 1419 with the city's capitulation. By that point, Henry controlled most of northern France. What made the endgame possible was a murder he didn't commit. In September 1419, the Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless, the man who had watched Agincourt from a careful distance and then exploited its aftermath, was invited to a peace conference at Montereau by the Dauphin's agents. They killed him. The assassination of the Burgundian Duke did not end the Armagnac-Burgundian conflict. It inflamed it beyond any possibility of resolution. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, concluded that the only way to avenge his father's murder and protect Burgundian interests was an alliance with England. With Burgundian support, Henry could negotiate directly with Charles VI's government. The French crown had no remaining options. The Treaty of Troyes, signed on the 21st of May, 1420, was the culmination of everything that had begun with the decision to march from Harfleur to Calais in October 1415. Henry V was recognized as regent of France and as heir to the French throne upon Charles VI's death. He married Catherine of Valois, Charles VI's daughter, the French princess, at Troyes Cathedral 2 weeks after the treaty's signing. The Dauphin, the future Charles VII, was disinherited. The two crowns of England and France were to pass together to Henry and his heirs. This was the closest the Plantagenet dream had come to reality in nearly a century of war. It was also the most fleeting. Henry V died on the 31st of August, 1422. He was 34 years old. The cause was dysentery, the same disease that had stripped his army at Harfleur and harried the march to Agincourt 7 years earlier. He died at Bois de Vincennes in France, 2 months before Charles VI of France also died, on the 21st of October, 1422. In an irony that seems almost deliberately cruel in the design of history, the younger, healthier king died before the older, incapacitated one. Henry V, who had been formally guaranteed the French throne, never became King of France. His heir was 9 months old. The child who inherited the English throne, Henry VI, possessed none of his father's gifts and eventually developed some of his maternal grandfather's afflictions, including prolonged periods of mental incapacity. The French position that Henry V had spent 6 years building disintegrated. Joan of Arc began her campaigns in 1429, turned the military tide at Orléans, and saw the Dauphin crowned at Reims as Charles VII. By 1453, England had lost every French territory except Calais. The poet Alain Chartier, writing in France shortly after the battle, described 4 noble ladies whose lovers had fought at Agincourt. Their grief rendered in formal verse that makes the social catastrophe personal. Henry died of dysentery at 34. The war that had made him the most celebrated king of his generation ended badly for England 2 decades after his death. The Treaty of Troyes is dead law. Agincourt itself is a village in Pas-de-Calais that most visitors to France have never heard of. And yet, what happened in those 3 hours of October, mud remains in the military history books of nations that weren't there. The Duke of Burgundy reached Paris before Henry had even left France. Within 10 days of the battle at Agincourt, Philip, still technically the Duke of Burgundy and already calculating the post-Armagnac landscape, had begun maneuvering toward the French capital. The Armagnac faction that had assembled, led, and lost the French army at Agincourt was now without most of its senior leadership. Dead on the field, imprisoned in England, or too shattered by the defeat to function effectively. The civil war that had divided France before Henry's invasion did not end with Agincourt. It deepened. The faction that had answered England's challenge had been destroyed in the answering, and the faction that had sat out the battle was now moving to fill the space where the Armagnac leadership had been. This is the part of Agincourt's story that rarely makes it into the English retelling. Not what the victory gave England, but what the defeat did to France. French sources from the period and after refer to the battle as le jour maudit, the accursed day. The grief literature produced in France in the years following Agincourt is extensive and specific. Christine de Pizan, one of the most significant writers of medieval French literature, wrote her Épître de la prison de vie humaine, the letter concerning the prison of human life, explicitly addressing the grief of French noblewomen in the aftermath of the battle. Alain Chartier's Livre des Quatre Dames features 4 noblewomen discussing whose suffering is greatest: the one whose lover was killed, the one whose lover was captured, the one whose lover fled, and the one who simply does not know. These are not abstract literary exercises. They were written for a specific audience of women who had lost specific men at a specific battle. The social dimensions of the loss were, in some regions of France, genuinely catastrophic. The Herald's documentation of 3,069 identified noble dead plus 2,600 unidentified represents not just military casualties, but the elimination of the administrative and military class that governed large portions of northern France. Noble estates without male heirs meant contested inheritances, feudal obligations disrupted, local governance destabilized. The warrior aristocracy that formed the core of French military power needed years to rebuild, and it was rebuilding under conditions of continuing civil war, while Henry's army methodically took Normandy. The Burgundian alliance, born from the ashes of Agincourt's political aftermath, ultimately proved as catastrophic for France as the battle itself. The murder of John the Fearless at Montereau in 1419, the event that drove Burgundy into open alliance with England, was the direct consequence of the power vacuum that Agincourt had created. A France united under competent leadership might have found a way to manage both the English threat and the Burgundian ambition. A France decapitated at Agincourt could not. What stopped the bleeding, eventually, was Joan of Arc, a teenager from Lorraine who began her campaigns in 1429, had, by 1431, turned the military tide enough that Charles VII could be crowned at Reims in the traditional manner of French kings, with whatever symbolic force that coronation carried. She was burned at the stake in May 1431 by English allied authorities. By 1453, 22 years after her execution, France had expelled the English from every territory except Calais and had reversed every territorial gain that Agincourt had made possible. The accursed day lasted 14 years. Then France found someone brave enough, or faithful enough, or simply angry enough to make it stop. The battlefield at Agincourt today is private farmland in the Pas-de-Calais. A French family has worked those fields for generations. One of their ancestors died fighting the English there. There is a museum in the village, the Centre Historique Médiéval, that lists the names of combatants from both sides. The field itself has no monument, no plaques mark where the heaps of the dead were. The ground has been plowed and unplowed and plowed again for 600 years. And it grows wheat now. And it does not remember the blood it drank in October 1415. The words that most English-speaking people associate with Agincourt were written 184 years after the battle. William Shakespeare's Henry V, composed approximately in 1599, drew primarily on Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of 1587, and earlier sources that had themselves been working from chronicles composed decades after the battle. The St. Crispin's Day speech, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers," is magnificent literature. It has been used to move audiences, inspire soldiers, and define an ideal of English communal courage that survives in popular culture to this day. It is also, as a historical document, a 1599 composition, not a record of what Henry said on the morning of October the 25th, 1415. This distinction matters for understanding both the battle and its legacy. What the Gesta Henrici Quinti records is that Henry did speak to his troops before the battle, that he was present among them, that his manner was calm and deliberate, and that he attributed the outcome entirely to God's will rather than to military skill. The specific rhetorical architecture of Shakespeare's speech, its particular genius for creating solidarity through the inversion of disadvantage, abracadabra, he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother, is Shakespeare's achievement, not Henry's documented words. The emotional truth the speech captures, a king present with his men, refusing the safety of retreat, asking them to share danger rather than escape it, is grounded in what the Gesta actually records. Shakespeare exaggerated the odds, invented the rhetoric, and built a myth from a foundation that was genuinely there. Anne Curry, emeritus professor of medieval history at the University of Southampton and the foremost contemporary expert on the battle, has described the cultural consequence of this myth with characteristic directness. The image of the battle that people have in their minds is Shakespeare's Agincourt, and this has affected our written culture ever since. The speech was quoted and performed during both World War I and World War II as a means of sustaining English morale. Laurence Olivier's 1944 film of Henry V was explicitly produced for wartime audiences. And the connections between the medieval English fighting against overwhelming odds and the contemporary British fighting against overwhelming odds were deliberately drawn. What had been a historical battle became a national template for a certain kind of defiance. This appropriation has costs. Shakespeare's Henry V includes almost no mention of the prisoner massacre, the single most ethically complex act of the battle. His treatment of French casualties is triumphalist in a way that erases the specific grief that Christine de Pizan and Alain Chartier were writing about within years of the actual event. The numbers Shakespeare puts in Henry's mouth, 60,000 French against 12,000 English, are medieval chronicle exaggerations that the St. Crispin's Day speech treats as fact. As Curry's own revisionist work, her 2005 Agincourt, a new history which argued based on administrative records that the French numbered approximately 12,000 rather than the mainstream estimate of 20,000 to 36,000, challenged the myth from the opposite direction. If she is right, the famous odds are not quite as extreme as the tradition insists. Her conclusions remain disputed by historians, including Barker, Sumption, and Rogers, who find the administrative records incomplete and the eyewitness testimony for larger French numbers persuasive. The debate has not been settled. What neither side of that debate disputes is this: Shakespeare's Agincourt is a myth built on a real event that has done more to shape how English-speaking people understand courage, community, and national identity than any work of pure history. The Agincourt Carol celebrated a battle. Shakespeare enshrined it. And enshrinement, as any historian will tell you, is a different process from understanding, one that preserves the shape of events while sometimes losing the texture of what they cost. The heralds' lists have 3,069 names. The myth has a speech. History lives in the tension between them. 600 years of analysis have produced a fairly stable consensus on what went wrong for France at Agincourt, and what that wrong has to teach anyone who faces a battle they believe they should win. The first lesson is terrain as weapon. Henry's advance to the tree lines, documented in the Gesta and confirmed by multiple sources, was not a charge. It was a geometry problem being solved. A 900 to 1,000 yard front between two woodlands meant that 20,000 French men-at-arms could not deploy their numerical advantage simultaneously. They could only fight as many men as the width of the field allowed at any given time. The historians at Battlefield Travels, in their analysis of the battlefield, note that Henry's deliberate choice of fighting position transformed the numerical equation before the first arrow flew. The French vanguard of 4,800 men-at-arms was roughly equivalent to the entire English force. The other 25,000 French soldiers were, for the critical opening phases of the battle, spectators. The second lesson is command structure failure. D'Albret and Boucicaut were right. They argued against a direct engagement, for patience, for using French numerical superiority to surround and starve the English. They were overruled not by superior tactical arguments, but by social rank and the imperative of chivalric honor. The French nobility needed to be in the vanguard, fighting in the manner appropriate to their station, winning glory and ransoms. This need overrode professional military judgment at every critical decision point. The timing of the battle, the positioning of the missile troops, the management of the cavalry charge, the density of the formation. Command structures that cannot translate good tactical advice into action, because social hierarchy prevents it, are not military organizations. They are militarized social institutions, and social institutions optimize for the wrong things in the middle of battles. The third lesson is the limits of numerical superiority, which is not the same as saying numbers don't matter. They matter enormously. What Agincourt demonstrates is the conditions under which they stop mattering. When terrain prevents deployment, when command dysfunction prevents coordination, when weather turns the physical advantage of armor into a liability, and when the side with fewer numbers has positioned itself and prepared its ground to fight on its own terms. The French had an overwhelming numerical advantage and used it to pack their best fighters so tightly they could barely raise their arms. Numbers, applied without tactical intelligence, become mass. The fourth lesson is about institutional knowledge versus individual genius. Henry was not inventing tactics at Agincourt. He was applying a 70-year-old playbook, the same defensive archery system that had won at Crécy and Poitiers, with discipline and precision on ground that made it maximally effective. Military historians, including those whose work informs the Battlefield Travels Analysis, note that what distinguished Agincourt was not the tactics, but the execution. The advance to close the flanks against the trees, the disciplined stake setting, the willingness to advance toward the enemy rather than wait and weaken. The lesson is not that Henry was uniquely brilliant. It is that he was thoroughly prepared, and that thorough preparation applied on the right ground reliably defeats numerical superiority. And the fifth lesson, the one that sits most uncomfortably alongside the others, is that the prisoner massacre happened. A man capable of the disciplined genius of Agincourt was also capable of ordering the killing of unarmed prisoners under pressure. The same king who stood over his wounded brother in the front rank, who walked among his men the night before battle, who entered London in a plain helmet attributing everything to God, gave an order that contemporary sources found appalling and that modern historians recognize as a war crime. Both are true. The chronicles do not resolve the contradiction, and neither should we. The lesson of Agincourt is not the story of a perfect commander. It is the story of a specific man, in a specific crisis, making decisions that ranged from extraordinarily brilliant to ethically catastrophic. The brilliant ones saved his army. The catastrophic ones saved his position and killed men who had already surrendered. History is not a morality play. Agincourt proves it on both sides. A wooden stick thrown into the air by an old man. That was the signal. That is where it started. On the morning of October 25th, 1415, St. Crispin's Day, the feast of the brother martyrs, approximately 6,000 English soldiers stood on a plowed field in northern France, sick and hungry, and 260 miles from anywhere they were supposed to be. Sir Thomas Erpingham, a knight grown gray with age and honor, according to the Gesta Henrici Quinti, raised his baton. The word he called nestroke means now strike. The archers knocked their first arrows. The sky went dark. What followed was 3 hours. 3 hours in which the herald's lists would eventually record 3,069 knights and squires killed with heraldic identification, and another 2,600 bodies found without names. 3 hours in which 3 dukes, 9 counts, the Constable of France, the Admiral of France, and the Master of Crossbowmen, along with 3 of his sons, died in the mud of a freshly plowed field that the weather had decided, impartially, would be difficult for armored men to cross. Approximately 400 English soldiers also died, among them Edward, Duke of York, whose title passed to a 4-year-old. The casualty ratio, derived from the mainstream scholarly estimates, approaches 15 to 1. Most military historians treat it as one of the most extreme asymmetries in the documented record of medieval warfare. Within 10 days, the Duke of Burgundy was marching on Paris. Within 5 years, the Treaty of Troyes had made Henry V regent of France and heir to the French throne. Within 7 years, Henry was dead of dysentery at 34, and the treaty died with his capacity to enforce it. Within 14 years, Joan of Arc had turned the war around. Within 38 years, England had lost everything except Calais. The battle bought time, extraordinary time, consequential time, but time spent does not accumulate. We began with a question the chronicles raise but do not answer. Why was Henry so certain? Why did a king whose council begged him not to march choose to walk 260 miles toward the largest army in France rather than sail home to safety? The Gesta hints at the answer without quite providing it. Henry believed, genuinely and without apparent irony, according to the chronicler who was there, that the outcome of battle was not his to determine. His job was to choose the right ground, arm the right men, advance at the right moment, and trust that what followed was ordained. Whether that belief was faith or strategy, or the particular clarity that comes to men who have been marching in their own illness for 17 days and simply have no more room for doubt, the Gesta does not say. What it says is that he won, that 5,000 men who had cut away their own breeches on the march stood on a field at Agincourt and destroyed the assembled military aristocracy of France, that the heralds counted the dead and named the battle, and the old knight threw his stick into the October sky. The ground at Agincourt grows wheat now. The walls of the Centre Historique Médiéval carry the names of men from both sides who came to a farmer's field in Picardy and did not leave it. The battle lasted 3 hours. 600 years have not been enough to stop arguing about what it means. That might be the most honest summary of what a great battle is. Something that ends in an afternoon and takes centuries to understand. Henry V was 28 years old. He had a crown that his father stole and a battlefield that the weather made. And on one October morning, he stood between 2 forests and proved that numbers are only destiny until they aren't. The old man threw the stick. The sky went dark. The rest is history, the actual kind, that refuses to be simple, that carries the weight of thousands of names the heralds had to count one by one in the mud and the fading October light.